Ukraine's counteroffensive is, how should I say, a utter failure. And I mean, we've known this. We've known that Ukraine has been struggling. We are in month 2+ now of the so-called counteroffensive, or at least we're getting into month number 2, the end of month number 2. And you've seen all across the collective West mainstream media, you've seen over and over and over again, story after story about how Ukraine is struggling and how there are a lot of admissions now from the mainstream media that Ukraine is just not doing so well on the military front. And this is important for many reasons. I'm no military expert, but with Ukraine struggling to make any progress on the front lines, with Zelensky continuing to complain about the level of aid that Ukraine is receiving from NATO, its NATO backers, from the United States, from the collective West, with all of this occurring, you see this shift that Pepe Escobar talked about on this channel, this shift to try to maybe deflect and distract from the situation there, to take your eyes off of it, move them toward China, move them toward the DPRK, move them anywhere else, really globally, in order to save face. And so the New York Times published an interesting article that the guys at the Duran covered, and I'm going to play their analysis of this media phenomenon in a bit, and about the counteroffensive and how it's really become a Russian offensive that is leading to many successes for Russia. But New York Times wrote in its world section very recently, in the last few days, the main thrust of Ukraine's offensive may be underway now. So they're talking about now. And of course, this article was written July 26th. So not too long ago. This article is saying that now it's starting. But July 26th is almost 2 months from when this counteroffensive started. So now the so-called officials in the Pentagon are saying that the main thrust of the counteroffensive, throwing in thousands of troops held in reserve, many of them Western trained and equipped, are being thrown out into the offensive, said 2 Pentagon officials on Wednesday, hours after Russian officials reported major Ukrainian attacks in the Zaporozhye region. So the Defense Ministry of Russia, the minister, the spokesperson for the Russia's defense ministry, Igor Konashenkov, said that Ukrainians had mounted a massive assault on 3 battalions reinforced with tanks south of the town of Orkiv, and then another a few miles south of the village of Robotin, according to state news agency TASS. Both were repelled. So, of course, they're exaggerating the impact of this, that there's no progress made. All of the attacks are repelled, but you see what the New York Times is doing here. Things are getting better, according to the New York Times, for Ukraine. But nothing could be further from the truth, and I'll show you why in a bit. So other American officials, though, cautioned that the latest Ukrainian attack might be preparatory operations for the main thrust, or perhaps just reinforcements to replenish war-weary units. So they don't even know. This is what you get in New York Times articles or anything in the collective West media. It's all speculation. It could be this, it could be that, while trying to promote to you that it is something actually more significant than it is. So, speaking on the condition of anonymity to discuss internal deliberations, officials at the White House and Pentagon said on Wednesday that they were watching the increased activity with keen interest, and that Ukrainian officials had told them of the new operation, if successful, would last 1 to 3 weeks. It's a big test, said the senior official. So they said, these administration officials and analysts said, it might be only a matter of days to assess whether the attacks might be successful. It will be clear soon whether this attack will allow Ukraine to change the current dynamic, said a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which, of course, is another national, it's another one of these think tanks funded by the State Department. So Ukrainian officials are declining to confirm that this took place at all. And now you have them talking about how the the United States and its Western allies have trained about 63,000 Ukrainian troops, according to the Pentagon, supplied more than 150 modern battle tanks, a much larger number of older tanks, hundreds of infantry fighting vehicles, and thousands of armored vehicles. All of those figures continue to rise, and much of that manpower and gear has been held in reserve until now, as Ukrainian forces fought to find or create strategic vulnerability they could exploit. because how long it's taken them a long time to find strategic vulnerabilities because they're not finding any, and it's not happening. This all gets back to the point that they don't have enough, and I'm going to show you why that is. But of course, Ukrainian troops say they're pushing back step by step. They're going to try to seize more territory, blah, blah, blah. So that's what the New York Times is saying, right? But they do admit the enemy continues to put up strong resistance, moves units, and actively uses reserves. So they're admitting this, okay? They're admitting that Russia is in a pretty good position, and that look at this, Zelensky, we believe in our boys. We continue to work. And then it says, but it is the Russians who are on the offensive in other contexts. So again, you have all of this conversation about, well, this could be the offensive. This could be it. We're going to see how well it goes. They're well equipped, supposedly. But then you get the admission that it's Russia that's on the offensive. It's Russia that's launching large-scale aerial bombardments of Ukraine, firing these cruise and ballistic missiles. It's Russia that is sending warplanes, firing 36 cruise missiles, 4 ballistic missiles. It's happening all of the time. Russia is the one that has the advantage. And of course, they're talking about the grain deal. I don't have to go over this entire article for you to know that the New York Times is trying to promote Ukraine as being now on the offensive, despite the fact that we've had 7 weeks, 8 weeks, and approaching 2 months of utter and complete failure, not being able to break any of Russia's defenses along the front line. But it gets worse from here, okay? And I'm just going to share with you just some of the stories that have been popping up. The White House saying that F-16s are not going to be decisive in Ukraine, and this is a big part of the escalation. This is the next step that we've heard so much about. Get Ukraine an air force again that can defend its territory, supposedly, that can defend its supposed territory from Russia. It's the only way. But the White House is saying, Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, second in command to Blinken, says that while they're moving rapidly to help Ukraine get the capability it needs, it also says that it is not going. He also said it's not going to be decisive in the conflict. Russia is somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 900 fourth and fifth generation fighters, and yet they have not played a significant role in Russia's counteroffensive or defensive efforts in the south or the east. Why is that? And he asked that because both sides have been using air defense technology, right? They both have pretty significant air defense systems, which negates this prospect. So all of this is a moot point, he's saying. And despite that, despite the fact that there's other issues, not just that Russia has a has a very advanced air defense system, but not only this, Jake Sullivan said it could take years to train Ukrainian pilots to fly the F-16s, and that a significant amount of the time and money would be needed to provide enough F-16s to match Russia's air fleet. So even if you subtract the fact that Russia has a superior air defense system, Ukraine also has one, that there's a reason why this isn't being fought air to air. There's a reason why this is not the primary means for fighting this conflict. But also you factor into the account that Ukraine is never going to be able to catch up. Ukraine is not going to be able to build and train and deploy these kind of weapons, this kind of military strategy. It just won't be able to do it. And so that's the White House admitting. And so the Russia having this very capable advanced air defense system is very important. And it's incredibly important because NATO has already lost much of its, and we go story by story by story. NATO has already lost much of the equipment that it has sent to Ukraine. And all of this, of course, has come in the form of infantry vehicles, ammunitions, artillery, and of course, you have the so-called tanks that have been slow to come. But once they're deployed, this is what happens to them. Here are Leopard 2 tanks being burned to the ground by Russia, by Russian airstrikes. That's what they've been doing. So the Ukrainian military is changing its tactics in an attempt to avoid significant casualties. So far blighted, blighting its counteroffensive against Russian forces. This is what the Financial Times had to say. So they're all saying the same thing. They're all saying that Ukraine is changing strategy. New York Times is saying one thing, the counteroffensive may be starting now because forces have been held in reserve. The Financial Times is saying, well, actually, Ukraine is still freezing this counteroffensive because the losses have been incredibly heavy. Russia is estimating over 25,000 Ukrainian casualties over the course of this very short 8-week period that this counteroffensive has been going on. And so the Financial Times cites an article from the New York Times that says that NATO has already lost 20% of its weaponry that it has provided and supplied to Ukraine, supplied to Kiev, and that a significant number of troops have also died. And Russia is saying it's over 25K, dead or injured. So this has been a failure. So you have 20% of the equipment gone, and that's only going to continue so long as the counteroffensive continues, and it will. They're not going to stop this. This freeze period is really, of course, another recalibration. But the news does not get better, right? Every single day, it feels like you have more and more foreign policy analysts, these neocons, these think tankers, these strategists, these people who are responsible for relaying the message or crafting the design of military strategy on behalf of the military industrial complex, on behalf of the Pentagon, on behalf of NATO. They're all saying the same things now. They're all saying that this is a stalemate. Ukraine cannot win. That this isn't, now they're saying this is insane. It's the definition of insane. USA Today has reported that advisors have argued that Ukraine is trapped in a stalemate and that Russia never intended to conquer the country. So things we've been saying over and over and over again on this channel have in fact been true. Russia was not trying to conquer the country. Russia was not trying to destroy Ukraine, and that this military conflict was never winnable because Russia's objectives were rational. Russia's objectives were very much planned, very much strategized, while NATO was trying to use Ukraine all along as a proxy to fight Russia, and that was never going to succeed in a conflict like this. A proxy war fought like this is destined to fail because what did the empire do? This is the big point for me, is the empire decided to far outstretch itself much more rapidly than I think. I'm not going to say it didn't know this. I think it knew all of these things, but outstretched itself well farther than it could go. And I think that there was awareness of this, but it didn't matter. This had to be done according to their estimation. So continue to arm Ukraine and expecting it to defeat Russia is strategic insanity, said Washington and other NATO members, because Kiev was locked in a stalemate with a foe that never aimed to conquer the former Soviet Republic, says the USA Today, citing multiple U.S. foreign policy experts. So let's hear what they had to say, okay? So Georgetown University professor Sean McFate, who's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, this is the NATO think tank, told the newspaper that Vladimir Zelensky has begun to lose credibility and that Kiev's main asset with Western benefactors. He claimed that Zelensky has locked himself in a position in which he can't win, but can't afford to lose either. NATO is experiencing donor fatigue and disappointment with Zelensky's bluster. I mean, I think we're all fatigued with Zelensky's bluster, but this goes along with what I've been saying about who Zelensky is. Zelensky is a puppet, and puppets are not supposed to speak to their puppet masters in this way, but he has over and over and over again decided to pressure as if he's the one with the leverage. And I think he actually believes he's the one with the leverage, given that NATO needs Ukraine in this conflict just as much as Zelensky needs this conflict. That's his conclusion, in my opinion. And so the definition of strategic insanity is continuing to send billions of dollars worth of weaponry to Ukraine on expectations that Zelensky's regime can win. And then you have more. So Air Force veteran Stephen Myers, who is now an entrepreneur and advises the State Department, also says that a stalemate was the most likely outcome because, contrary to the Western political media narrative, Vladimir Putin never intended a war of conquest. NATO members have argued that Ukraine must be supported because Putin planned to conquer Kiev and move westward, but Myers suggested that Russia has proven otherwise. Ding, 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 ding. This is not how this is them. This is straight from the horse's mouth. This is what they are saying, that strategically this war is lost by both sides before it started. It will end in stalemate, which I think was Putin's intent from the get-go. Well, I would disagree there. I don't think it's the intent for Putin to be in a stalemate. That's just the situation objectively. That's just what's going to happen so long as NATO is willing to prop up Ukraine with whatever minimally it can do, even just minimally. Because what would happen if Russia were to full scale conduct regime change, steamroll through? Well, then NATO would be given carte blanche to escalate, and perhaps there would be a wider conflict, which, while NATO wouldn't be justified in its documentation, I don't think you can trust NATO to behave well should Russia go for total victory in a very rapid manner. No matter how much I think that many people are like, let's end this, let's get this over with. There's a lot of those feelings. I get those sentiments. I see them in the comments. I see them on Telegram. I see them everywhere. But we have to acknowledge the fact that while NATO may be a paper tiger, that doesn't mean a paper tiger isn't armed with perhaps very irrational, very dangerous moves that would not be in Russia's interest. So you have that dynamic. And you have these security officials basically saying, such as Stephen Myers, this professor from Georgetown University, who's a really large player at the Atlantic Council, they're saying the same things. They're saying Ukraine is done. This is over. They've lost. And we shouldn't have been surprised by that because the narrative has been false all along. So I want to pull up what the Duran folks had to say about this development, because these are flurrying developments. This is a constant kind of media reporting that I don't think is paid attention to enough. So I'm going to start. We'll listen to several minutes. I'll react to some of what they had to say, and because I do think that this is an important moment, and they had a lot of interesting points also to add here. So let's get to it.
Of the territory has been retaken by Ukraine that Russia initially captured. We have a lot of different statements, finger pointing, some blame game, but a lot of different statements came out over the weekend. And then, of course, you had Putin's statement about 26,000 casualties, and a lot of casualties from mercenaries as well. So a lot of activity going on. We do have a counteroffensive breakthrough. Everything in Zaporozhye and Kherson seems pretty static. Nothing. I haven't seen any movement there. Heavy fighting in Rapatino, but for the most part, the big movement is in the Kharkiv area, as well as all kinds of statements from all kinds of collectivist officials from Zelensky, and it seems like they're all trying to put the blame on someone as to why this is a failure. So, pick which one you want to talk about first, and let's add some context to all of this.
I think you've covered it. I think, again, you've covered it very concisely and very comprehensively. Just a few things. First of all, this talk about Ukraine paying huge price in blood for every 100 meters that it gains. I haven't seen any evidence up to this point that Ukraine has actually gained any ground in any place that it's able to hold whatsoever for several weeks now. I mean, they gained some ground, some open fields and such things in the first weeks of the offensive. But more recently, in the last 2 weeks or so far as I can see, it's, at least in the south, it's ground to a complete stop. So what they're actually doing is worse than what the Kiev Post said. They are losing lives, attacking, but making no progress whatsoever. And they're losing lives, and they're losing tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, and of course, shells. Now you can, to some extent, replace or repair the tanks and the infantry fighting vehicles. Some of them, of course, get completely destroyed, but some of them you can take back to your front lines, ship them back to Poland, have them repaired there. It takes a while, but at least you can bring those back. But of course, shells you can't replace because the US itself tells us that they've run out. and men you're having increasing trouble replacing. I mean, more of them are dying. And there's been reported, a long report today in the New York Times, that human casualties in the Ukraine military have been horrific, that the men who are now being brought into service are older. That makes them less reliable and effective as soldiers, less willing to obey orders. The whole thing, in terms of the offensive, the Ukrainian offensive, is dreadful. And
So it is dreadful. I mean, that's when I pulled up earlier, 20% of equipment being destroyed. And of course, many more pieces of equipment, hugely important for their war effort, having to be sent back for repair or replaced altogether. I mean, that is dreadful. And then this idea of older people. I mean, this is you can't even keep up with the New York Times reports about how bad things have become. But when you look at this idea of older people coming in, it wasn't so long ago that they were conscripting 16-year-olds to fight, who, mind you, I'm not a military expert, but I don't think you want a 16-year-old being thrown out there to fight with minimal training. I don't think you want that, because I don't know if you've met 16-year-olds, you have a 16-year-old child, a teenager, remember what it was like to be 16. May not be the best idea to have them be serious players in an offensive against a very well-trained military. But let's continue.
You see increasing recriminations. So you get people like Zelensky. We weren't given enough training. We weren't given enough weapons. It was all delayed for too long. In fact, he's actually, to some extent, reversing things. Because if you remember, if you take your mind back to what was going on in the spring, the weapons had been supplied, many of them. The training had been provided. You were getting all these slightly irritated reports coming from the US. Where is this offensive? Promises to get this offensive going. Lindsey Graham went to Kiev and had to be given the plan of the offensive. The Americans at that time were pushing the Ukrainians to launch the offensive. It's not true that the Ukrainians were, straining at the leash to launch the offensive earlier, and that it was the West that delayed them. If anything, it was the other way round. But the fact is, everybody can now see that the offensive was misconceived. And in fact, the reason the Ukrainians were reluctant to launch the offensive is because they knew perfectly well that they were facing these formidable Russian defenses. They probably had a better sense of how strong the Russian army was than people in the West did.
So I just want to interrupt there, because on this point, I mean, look, when I look at Zelensky's intransigence and his constant and utter maybe misbehavior toward his puppet masters, I also think about the fact, and of course Zelensky and the Ukrainian government, they were a part of this, telegraphing the counteroffensive for months and months. You were as they were preparing for it. So Russia being prepared with its advanced logistics, its military industrial complex, Russia not only was built for this conflict, like Russia has been preparing for this for years and years, but not only was it built to fight this conflict, but it also had months and months to prepare at the psychological level, at the preparatory level, on the ground, all strategic level, months and months, even for just this one event in the conflict. So it still baffles me that occurred, but it did occur. And so I just need to pause it there to to react to that point, because I think it's important. It's a big factor as to why Russia is even more prepared than maybe it could have been should Ukraine and maybe its NATO backers have played this a little more strategically. But obviously, I think what that reveals is this isn't about strategic victory or fighting towards that at all for the major players, those who are actually dictating this conflict. It's not about winning. It's about just engaging in this conflict. What does it mean in so many areas and fields? Militarily, the collective West could care less about how Ukraine does. And I truly believe that.
In the United States did. And we now have this, I find it absolutely infuriating article in the Wall Street Journal. I mean, I was angry when I read it, saying, that we supplied Ukraine. Ukraine was supplied with inadequate weapons and inadequate training. And the hope was that they would break through because of their better spirit, courage, and skill, and all of that. That isn't true. That isn't true either, by the way. The US has a pretty good understanding, I think, of the Ukrainian army. What they thought would happen was that the Russians would turn tail and run, that they believed their own propaganda about the Russian military being corrupt, disorganized, demoralized, all of those kind of things. But come back to the cynicism. Who pushes an army to launch an offensive with inadequate weapons and inadequate training in the hope that its superior spirit will break through? I mean, that is terrible. You don't do that. At least not that I can understand. You don't do that. If you can't provide Ukraine with the necessary numbers of weapons and the necessary amounts of ammunition and the necessary amounts of training, well, you don't ask them. You don't tell them to conduct the kind of offensive that they have been strong-armed into launching.
So this is where I would disagree with Alexander Mercouris, even though I rarely disagree with them, friends of the show, on this particular question of Ukraine, because they've been doing some of the best coverage. But the reason why I disagree, it's not a hostile disagreement. It's that as he's asking this rhetorically, I know that he knows that the United States does this. And the United States does this because they don't care about the proxies that they cultivate. They don't care about Ukraine. They didn't care about the Syrian rebels. They didn't care about the Libyan rebels. They certainly didn't care about any of the Iraqi forces that they sent out also into slaughter. They don't care about the Afghan so-called paramilitary and so-called military forces that they built up to fight the so-called Taliban, which clean their clock. They don't care about any of these forces. That go die as long as it serves them. I mean, if the dying didn't serve them, if the dead Ukrainian bodies didn't serve their particular agenda and their interests, the conflict would end. But it would have nothing to do with Ukrainians dying. It would have everything to do with, military objectives not being met. We're not sufficiently building up toward war with Russia, which is what I believe Ukraine is about militarily. Economically, we're not profiting off of these arms sales. We're not profiting off these arms deals. We're not able to basically fleece Ukraine's economy to the effect that we wanted. That's happening. That it is happening. So that is working. So there are things about the Ukraine conflict working for the military-industrial complex, for Wall Street, for these major players, for the NATO countries. It's working. It is provoking a broader war, which is what they want. Is what the neocons at the head of this, strategically at the head, politically at the head of this conflict. It's what they've wanted. So that's who. That's exactly who decides to push Ukraine's makeshift military that they've tried to build up more than a few times now. That's who does it.
And which they have been fighting over the last few weeks with these terrible losses. And of course, Putin and Lukashenko had another discussion. Lukashenko said that he was a former military officer himself. He's able to do calculations about losses by just looking at the numbers of armored vehicles that are destroyed. He said that he calculates that at least 26,000 men have been killed, not killed and wounded, killed. And Putin said it's actually higher than that. Ukraine is suffering even more losses than this. He didn't say how many, but it's more than 26,000. And he said that lots of foreign mercenaries, foreign fighters have been killed as well. And Putin said that the offensive is failing. He says it's not making any progress. And as you absolutely correctly say, there is progress on the battlefields. There is movement on the battlefields, but it is movement in the north where the Russians are steadily pushing forward.
So I'm going to end it there because I think the point is well taken. the progress is on Russia's side. The media narrative is hysterical. The Western mainstream media narrative is hysterical. And I have to correct myself now in my own video. I said 26,000 dead or wounded. This is just 26,000 killed in this so-called counteroffensive being waged by Ukraine at the behest of its NATO masters. That is an astounding number. That this has only been going on for, by the time this video is released, it'll probably be over 2 months. But as of this recording, it is less than 2 months of fighting, 26,000 plus, and you have Putin suspecting more based on the investigations and the counting that has been done. So that is why you have the narrative shifting. That is why you have less of this excitement. You have less of this, well, Ukraine is on its way to victory. Because anyone who has a thinking brain, who isn't just going to shill and shuck and jive for the empire, for the neocons, for the American empire, knows better, right? It knows better. And even these hucksters, even these hacks that literally will push any war that seems at all viable to launch because it serves their interests, their careers, the military industrial complex and the profits that fund their careers, even they are now saying this is going to be a net loss for Ukraine. There is not going to be a victory for Ukraine. No. So the desperation has set in. Ukraine is finished. I mean, Ukraine is finished as a country. I don't say that with pride. I say that with just the utmost and starkest communication of reality. That's just the reality. And this is not going to end in anything less than Eastern Ukraine, what used to be Eastern Ukraine, being Russia. It's going to continue to be Russia, all of Crimea, all the way to the Donetsk, Lugansk republics. All that whole territory is going to be Russia. And whatever happens to the West, we don't know what's going to happen to Kiev. It is not certain. The political future of Kiev is not stable at all. We don't know how Poland is going to play this. I know a lot of people have been saying, what about Poland, Danny? Poland, what is there to say about Poland other than it has its ambitions for this conflict? To me, it's still a very weak node, but it's one that has been empowered by the collective West to play a pretty insidious role and maybe empowered to the point where it's going to do its own thing. And perhaps the collective West will have to cede its interests as a NATO country and as one that sees the destruction of Ukraine as a potentially profitable venture for itself, right? Territorially, perhaps, militarily, economically, all of that. So you have this happening, all of this happening, and all of it points to this counteroffensive is a shrug of the shoulders. It is one that has led to massive deaths. So many more are coming, but the collective West is not going to stop. You didn't hear anywhere, even if they're saying it's insane, it's a stalemate, Ukraine's not going to get what it wants. Even former State Department advisors saying, well, this was never a war of Russian aggression. They weren't overtaking territory. That's not what they wanted. Even with all of that, there's no, maybe we should negotiate a peace deal. Maybe this needs to end. Maybe we can transition. But you have some moves. You have William Burns talking to, you have him being promoted in many respects. You have him talking to the Russian side intelligence-wise. You also have, as Pepe Escobar noted on this program, kind of a shift in attention. You have maybe an attempt to appease Russia on the sidelines in these backdoor channels and talks in order to focus on the real threat, which they believe is China. But even so, there's not going to be a peace deal. There's not going to be an end. There's not going to be any kind of armistice, nothing like that anytime soon. Because sometimes when the ball is set into motion, it's kind of like when you throw a bowling ball at pins. It's like no matter how much you wish and hoped you had thrown it in a different direction, it's still going to go. The bowling ball is going to go. It's going to hit where it hits. It's going to go into the gutter, or it'll hit one or two pins. And then, you failed. It's a failure. It's a failed, it's a failed toss. You know, you didn't win that round, and that this is something that the collective West is going to have to come to terms with. How they do it, though, is not predictable, because the collective West, what is predictable is that it'll continue to pursue war. It's going to continue to pursue this path. It's going to continue to kill massive numbers of Ukrainian troops and foreign mercenaries. It's going to waste away all of these stockpiles, whatever's left of them. It's going to continue to cause these economic disruptions. It's going to continue to cause problems for the rest of the world. We can predict all of that. What we can't predict is when the losses mount up to the point where something has got to give. That moment is coming, and it's not that far away. And it's not predictable what the collective West will do. Can it pull back from the brink of a hot war with Russia? Can it pull back from what seems to be an existential and absolutely religious kind of experience and objective in Ukraine against Russia? I'm not so sure about that, which is why we need to continue to place the pressure on in the information sphere and in all spheres, continue to place the pressure on the collective West, on the United States at the head of it, to cease this conflict, to stop its role. That is where the problem has always resided. And that's where the problem will continue to grow. All of these problems will continue to grow until it is forced to pull out. And Russia will indeed be the biggest force facilitating that as it marches toward whether we want to call it victory or whether we want to call it just the inevitability of this conflict going in its favor, because victory is a tough word to use when NATO won't stop. You could literally, Russia could achieve all of its objectives, but you know the collective West is going to respond. So that's the facts. That's the facts. That's the fact of the whole matter. And Ukraine is in a state of desperation. This counteroffensive, to me, it's essentially over. The New York Times is saying it's just beginning. But to me, it's essentially over, because what you have is a dynamic that's not going to change. There could be heavier activity. There could be more fighting. Doesn't matter. It's not going to change the dynamic. So what kind of offense? We need to stop calling it an offensive, I guess, and just call it a rolling loss, an ebb that will ebb and that will flow and that will move in different directions, but it will be a continuous rolling defeat. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyHaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.